Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. For this week's video, I want to present another layout design. And this one is a little bit different from the layouts that I have normally done, mainly because my client is from Sweden, more specifically from the island of Gotland, which is southeast of the country in the middle of the Baltic Sea. Now, with a population of only about 58,000 and barely 100 miles long, it really isn't big enough or populous enough to have a decent railway of its own. But for the premise of this layout design, we ask ourselves a what if. What if the island was big enough and populous enough to support a proper railway? Or even better, supposing we extended the island towards the mainland so that it was close enough to be connected to the rest of Sweden by either a bridge or a causeway, much like the Florida Keys or Anglesey Island in North Wales. The client is working in N scale. Here is a site plan of his room. It is 4,670 millimeters long by 4,175 millimeters wide. Or in imperial measurements, that's approximately 15'4" by 13'8". So for N scale, it is a pretty good sized space. Now the room has to serve as an occasional guest bedroom. You can see in the corner here we have two rectangles, one representing the bed and another representing a small desk. Those were the minimum requirements for additional furniture that had to remain usable despite the presence of the railroad. And later on in the design, I showed how additional bedroom furniture could be incorporated as well, using the space under the benchwork. But I'll get more into that later. So we both agreed fairly early on that the only sensible location for the bedroom furniture was in this northeast corner. The bed can be right out of the way. It doesn't quite fit turning it around the other way because it will foul the door. But it just about fits in this corner in this orientation, allowing the desk to go in front of one of the windows, where it is ideally located. Now we have windows at A and B. He said he was okay with blocking one of the windows, provided the other one was left clear to admit natural light. Now also, it turns out there's a light switch at D, although location C is clear. So we can take the benchwork right up to the door trim. And this red line represents the approximate extent of the area that we can use for the railroad, showing that we basically have about 3/4 of the room available to us. I tried several different footprints. This first drawing shows how with 500 millimeters or 20-inch wide benchwork around two sides and 3-foot or 900 millimeter aisles in front of it, we really can't get a decent curve without coming too close to the bedroom area. This double track curve is shown at 450 millimeters or about 18 inches on the inside track. It should be noted that, as with most of Europe, the tendency is for shorter and far more frequent trains than we are used to in the US. So the vast majority of significant routes are double tracked. But anyway, as we can see from this drawing, clearly this isn't going to work. So we're going to have to shave our standards considerably if we are going to get any kind of peninsula into the layout space. Otherwise, we might have to settle for a simple dog bone around two walls. Here is one plan that I drew, showing how by shaving the benchwork along one wall down to a bare minimum and accepting a much narrower aisle, in this case only 600 millimeters or around 2 feet, we can just about get a peninsula in. And although it does cross this red line, we still have adequate clearance between the benchwork and the corner of the bed. Area C in the corner is where we figured we'd probably have a helix down to our staging yard. Because right from the beginning, he knew he wanted subterranean staging to avoid taking up too much of the layout space. Here is basically the same plan, but flipped around. And since the room is not quite a square, we do end up with some subtle but important differences. Although the peninsula is now shorter and the narrow benchwork is on the short wall, we have a much longer wide area where the yard can go. And we also end up with the second mini peninsula, which could be the site of some kind of industry. Now, as far as what the client wanted to include, he wanted a harbour area. He wanted grain and cement industries, preferably in the harbour, although he was okay if they were somewhere else. And he wanted a few significant industries elsewhere on the layout. He didn't want to cram the whole area with lots of small industries. He just wanted a few decent-sized ones, while at the same time leaving as much open running as possible, because he liked the idea of significant areas devoted to just open scenery, especially farmland and forests. Now, since the island of Gotland is not particularly mountainous, there's going to be no towering scenery or tall trestles or anything like that. But he did want a reasonable variety of different kinds of scene. Here's the next footprint I drew. And this one is different from the other two in that we've accepted a shorter mainline run. We've decided that a smaller peninsula, which we can devote to a harbour area, might actually be more valuable than increasing the main line into the peninsula. It also means that this lobe D can be significantly larger and therefore provide space for a better industry than we could otherwise have. And note how area C is duplicated. We can have our helix landing staging in either of the two corners. And also at this point, I broached the idea of going up to a partial scenic upper deck. The idea being that it means that we no longer have to have the main line running twice through the main scene. This is something that he'd asked me to avoid if possible, but he would accept if there was no other way. So after the suggestion, he asked me to show him how I thought that might work in the room. So here is the main deck with the main line drawn in. Note how we're no longer having to give up space for the main line to pass twice through the scene. I've shown the main station along the longest wall. I've put a double track Y in front of the side window, down to staging, and then the two main helixes go up to the upper deck. Also, something to note is the direction of the helixes. The client informs me that in Sweden, left-hand running is normal. So all the helixes are designed so that with left-hand running, the downhill trains take the inner route and the uphill trains the slightly longer and therefore shallower outer loop. And at this point, I've increased the minimum mainline radius from 450 to 500 millimeters because it looked as though that was going to be possible. And of course, the extra diameter on the helix gives us a significant shallower grade. And as I've already mentioned, Gotland is fairly flat, so there shouldn't really be any steep grades if we can possibly avoid them. Anyway, at this point, I haven't filled in any details. I'm just showing how the various scenes might fit in the room, with the harbour on the peninsula, a branch line wrapping around the back of the helix and coming up to join in the main yard area, showing how at the other end of the main yard there's a very short branch to another industry in this area. Here is the staging level, just a basic staging yard under the main station. And on the upper deck, much narrower benchwork around two walls. And there is room for a small branch line in the southeast corner. This wasn't something that he asked for, but it is a great location for another significant industry without stacking the operational areas directly above each other, as would be the case if you put it on the main line. And if we go back to the main deck, we can see that there is no major operational areas in front of the narrow aisle. And of course, the harbour can be switched from the other side in the bedroom area of the room, meaning that in all the significant operating areas, we still have our minimum 3-foot aisles all the way around here. Anyway, when I presented this rough design to the client, he thought this was definitely the way to go, and he wanted me to continue working on this plan exactly the way it was. So here is the next iteration, with a few track arrangements shown. I've indicated how the majority of the harbour peninsula can represent a single pier with water around 3 sides of it, how we can fit the grain and cement industries, and also a fairly long general merchandise wharf with a small yard in the middle. Regular viewers of mine may note that this cement industry here is basically copied from an HO scale layout that I presented recently, but reconfigured because the tracks now approach the wharf at a 90-degree angle. We're assuming that cement barges would tie up on the end of the pier, while the grain ships would occupy one side and general cargo vessels the other. Now in the main station area, I've shown just a pair of basic passenger platforms. Passenger trains never leave the main line, whereas all freight trains that call here will come off and go through the yard. I put a chain crossover at one end and use a single slip at the other just for variety. Oh, the client asked me to use the Pico Code 55 range, And I noticed from my track libraries that it does include a single slip. So I thought we would use one of those. And apart from that one single slip, I've been using all their long radius turnouts on the main line and the medium radius in yards and on branch lines. Now in this version, the branch line to the harbour only connects up with one of the yard tracks because I was trying to simplify the grades on the main line and also keep the harbour branch as shallow as possible. And thus I thought that I needed to come around the curve before hooking up to the level track. Now we discussed this idea and decided that even if it meant that the yard tracks were a little bit shorter, we needed to arrange it so that the harbour branch had access to all of them, since this is going to be the main reason that the yard is here in the first place, to interchange traffic to the harbour. So here is another variation with that problem fixed. And I did some calculations and found that by going to about a 1.2% grade on the main line, I could keep my harbour grade at no more than 2.5%. And we felt that even though the terrain is not particularly hilly, we could justify a 2.5% grade down to a harbour. And it turned out that the length of the yard tracks was hardly impacted at all anyway. And it also gave us the advantage of having more space in this corner where we could add a couple of locomotive spurs. And we thought that'd be a good idea because there'd be quite a lot of traffic down to the harbour, so there'll probably be a small pool of locomotives here for that purpose. So at the moment the yard is 5 through tracks and another shorter track in front of it. I'll probably kill the pronunciation here, but in Sweden they would call that a finalization, which is what we refer to as a team track in America. Now here I've shown one large industry on this mini peninsula, although at the moment we haven't decided what it's going to be, and an optional spur with a much smaller industry here. Although on later plans we abandoned this, he decided he didn't really want that small industry. Moving on to the upper deck now, I showed 2 variations of this. In this one the branch line diverges just above the main station and then runs to a small town here. He already knew that he wanted some kind of forestry industry here. And I showed how it's possible to extend the branch line through the backdrop and have a small stub-end staging yard over the top of the helix. Now we do have to have a bit of a grade up on the branch line, which means that the main line is going to be at a slightly lower level and therefore somewhat obscured. So to avoid that, I came up with a different version. In this version we see that the junction has been moved to the end wall of the room. The branch line is now much longer, runs around the back of the main line and crosses over it just before the main line disappears into the helix. And the bridge here would also help to obscure the exit. We have basically the same track arrangement with a small stub-end staging yard over the helix. Now, although at first I liked this version better, the client pointed out to me that we already had one place where 2 tracks crossed over each other, and a second one would probably be difficult to justify in such flat terrain. So we abandoned this version and went back to the simpler version of the branch line for all future iterations. Going back to the main deck now, there are a few changes here. In the harbour area, I have improved the track arrangement serving the grain elevator. We now have 3 tracks down this side of the pier, 2 of them under the unloading shed and a bypass track for releasing locomotives. And I've showed where there could be a truck unloading shed as well. We're assuming that a good portion of the export grain will arrive by road. Other than that, the harbour has remained the same. Note how I've already modified the Y, matching up the Pico curve turnouts with their long crossing. And the result is a lot more compact than it could have been with straight turnouts, even with custom curve crossings, which neither of us really wanted to build. So this uses all standard track components. I have reduced the minimum radius slightly, back to 450 millimeters on this curve, figuring that it's mostly obscured in tunnel and trees anyway. So as long as all his trains can negotiate it reliably, it's not a problem. I could have kept 500 millimeter radius around this curve, but by dropping it slightly, it allowed me to retain full-length easements and give ourselves a little bit more clearance between the main lines and the harbour. Also in this iteration, we have decided what this industry is going to be. We're going to have an oil refinery, except that the refinery is of course offstage in the aisle. We're just modelling the storage tanks and the railroad loading facilities. Initially, the client would have preferred this to be by the harbour, but that just wasn't going to work. And of course, the way the layout is presented, we're assuming that the mainline junction and the harbour are some distance apart. suggesting that this refinery is some distance from the coast. But we got around that by assuming that the area that was originally proposed for the refinery was home to a protected bird population. So they compromised by building a pipeline a few miles inland, thus saving the bird population. The other industry in this area is a municipal power plant. He decided fairly early on that that was one of the industries he wanted. And this one is going to actually burn wood, harvested in the forest on the upper deck and brought in by rail. The main reason for putting it here is that we have the opportunity for a tall smokestack, which is in the perfect location to help support the upper deck, thus allowing us to extend the upper deck benchwork beyond what we could otherwise have cantilevered from the backdrop. And since this yard is now rather oversubscribed, being the junction point for both the harbour branch and for the forestry branch on the upper deck, and also being needed to sort tank cars from the oil refinery, we decided to add one extra track to it. It's now 6 tracks wide, and there was still plenty of room to get it in without overcrowding. On the upper deck, I filled in all the remaining trackage. I mentioned earlier the support from the power plant chimney, allowing this benchwork to be extended somewhat. It's still cut well back from the lower deck, allowing the decks to be closer together without affecting the viewing too much. The passing loop in this small town is somewhat longer now than it used to be, and I've extended the single track through the backdrop, and the branch line staging now wraps around the corner over the top of the helix. I've split the industry here into 2. We have a log loading yard in the foreground and a wood chip loader behind it. We're figuring that anything that is not of an appropriate size to send down the hill as logs will just be run through the wood chipper and sold to a paper mill somewhere. And at this point, I broached the idea of also running passenger service on this branch line. We have a 3-track staging yard over the helix, so 2 freight trains can be staged at the start of a session on the longer tracks, and the front track can be used for a passenger train, and it would be either a diesel or electric multiple unit, thus eliminating the need to run around the locomotive and allowing it to make more than one round trip up and down the branch line during a single session without having to climb in here to restage it. And then I was wondering where the branch line passenger train should go. Obviously it will run off down this helix, arrive back at the main deck, and rather than just going straight down to staging, we decided that we were going to add a bay platform for it to terminate in this main town. So we've now added a lot more operational interest with just 3 additional turnouts. So by this point in the process, all the track has been fixed, and it's now just a case of filling in all the details and suggesting scenic treatments. Here is the main deck in all its glory. Note how during the design process, this harbour peninsula was extended just a couple of inches, allowing us to get some decent sized ships in here. I've assumed that much of the harbour pier will be concreted, with a good portion of the track laid in pavement, allowing road trucks to access all the areas that they need to. And the road will follow the railway, but climbing up a grade to go over the hill that the railway has to tunnel through. I've used tunnels around this area because it seemed like the easiest way to hide all the main lines that needed to disappear from view. A road bridge at this point wouldn't really have worked very well because of the branch line being so much lower in elevation from the main lines. I just don't think it would have looked right. So without having a really tall mountain here, I'm thinking that it's a much lower hill, but once again we're going to turn to the wildlife preservation argument and say that the area was a valuable ecosystem that they didn't want to destroy by putting numerous railway cuts through it, and they were forced to tunnel under the hill instead. I've suggested a small stream in this triangular area so that the landscape goes both above and below at this point. The point where the main lines cross over the harbour branch, the combination of the curve and the fine angle makes a traditional bridge very awkward, but I have seen a few prototype examples where they just built a concrete frame over the lower track and then used it as a deck to build the line over the top of it as though it doesn't exist. Not quite sure what that style of bridge is called though. I've drawn 2 signal cabins in. I'm assuming that we have the main cabin by the junction and the west cabin, which in the modern era would probably have been long since closed and boarded up. It could even have been demolished, but a boarded up structure is a lot more interesting than just an empty foundation. I've shown a solid row of background buildings along the whole of the south wall, suggesting a town large enough to justify a good-sized station like this. I've also drawn the station building over the top of the tracks, where it can be fairly large and complex, once again suggesting a much larger station than it really is. And in one corner, I brought the town forward, allowing for a short but worthwhile section of City Street with all the interesting detail that can be added. Note how at both ends, the structures in front of the street hide the awkward area where it hits the backdrop, while the narrow section in the middle can be finished as a park, so as not to hide the street details. At this end of this deck, I've put the main lines disappearing under a road bridge, with the ends of the road in turn hidden by dense trees. Moving to the upper deck now. Here we have a gradual transmission from farmland at one end to dense forest at the other, which is what the client specifically asked for. I've shown how a significant river bridge could be included in one location. Note, of course, that it's not a deep valley. The river need only be a few scale feet below track level, which of course solves another problem with having deep benchwork on the upper deck of a multi-deck layout. I've shown another water feature along the south wall. Here a stream running alongside in front of the branch line. Actually, I drew two versions of this. Here it runs off the front of the fascia at both ends. And in the other view, I show how it can dive under the tracks, given the opportunity for another couple of bridges if he wants them. Although personally, I think I prefer the other view, with a longer stream, and therefore the trains running further along the riverbank. I've shown how a small passenger station can be added in this area. Note that we're only serving it with a 3-car DMU, so the platform is fairly short. I've filled in the log loading yard with enough logs to make it look as though it's worthwhile. There's no loading facilities drawn in. The client had already decided that they load with forklifts. And across the other side of the track, we have the wood chip loader. And since on this deck, the color palette is pretty much all natural colors, I suggested that the machinery here can be painted a bright color, as it often is on the prototype, just to give us a splash of color in this area. Now at this end of the scene, both the branch line and the main line can disappear into dense clumps of trees. There's no need for additional road bridges like I used at the other end. On the single track, it'll be possible to have the trees arching completely over the track, forming a sort of natural tunnel, while on the main line, where that's not going to be feasible, I've shown enough trees to prevent anyone seeing the hole in the backdrop from any normal viewing angle. Now down to the staging deck, I did two very similar variations here. As we can see, the trains will come down the helix. And to start with, I was attempting to keep the turnouts toward the front of the benchwork instead of having them along the back wall, which is why with the left hand running, trains will be staged on the way in and will then have to run around the loop through the run-through track and back up the helix when they need it again. Turning the trains first would require the turnouts to be along the back wall. I've added some optional extra locomotive storage at one end and also shown how a continuous loop can be placed around the base of the helix, allowing the client to get a train running without having to complete the main line. Here he can start running trains as soon as he's built the staging deck. And also it's a great location for testing locomotives because the circuit here can be level instead of encompassing some long grades. And as I mentioned earlier, I drew in some additional furniture. I've shown how the peninsula here can easily be supported on a dresser. And in this location, I've shown a bookcase and a TV. Although none of this was asked for, the client thought it was a great idea. Here is the alternative staging yard that I drew. Basically the same schematic, except that arriving trains will run around the loop first and be staged facing towards the helix again. And note how the optional locomotive storage now gets moved to the other end of the yard, so it's at the head end of all the trains. It's a little bit more cramped here than it was in the other plan. So actually I think this is the better version. And although not shown, it's possible to shift this entire ladder further towards the end of the room, adding about an extra 6 inches per track. And that's something that the client can easily change at build time if he wants to. I don't think there's any need to specifically draw it. Anyway, before signing off, let's go back to the scenic areas. Although much of the time the client will just want to run the branch line while allowing 2 trains to circle on the main, for serious operating sessions, we have some interesting opportunities here. All mainline trains would start in the staging yard, would arrive at this point, and depending on which route they take at this junction, would run one way or the other around the main line, and would not run over this short section here in front of the window. They would just come up, do one circuit of the main line, traversing both decks, and then return to staging. Most of the freight trains would stop here and interchange blocks of cars that would be taken down to the harbour, or in some cases unit grain or cement trains may come up from staging all the way up the helix to the upper deck, run through the farmland, through the forest, back down again, and pull into the yard before continuing to the harbour, giving them a long end-to-end run, while trains for the branch on the upper level would take the straight route at this junction and would run up the northwest helix through the farmland and into the forest, where they would serve the branch line. Now, that does require a certain compromise, with this piece of main line being either north or south of the main town, depending on whether you're running a main line or a branch line train. But since model railroads are always going to be one compromise after another, we feel this is very minor and certainly workable. So before signing off, let's just go back to the main deck. I'm just going to leave this view here while I sign off. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and I hope to see you again next week. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.